So was Jesus sinning by getting angry? Of course not. In fact, we would call that righteous anger. And that caused him to act accordingly to bring about change in the situation that he saw. So the answer to question number 2, is anger a sin? Well, obviously, the answer is no. Anger in and of itself is not a sin. But here's the last question we need to answer before we can move on today in the message. And it's this, if you're still taking notes. Can anger be ignored? Can we afford it, or is it right to ignore our anger? Well, if you look at the book of James, there are some things that we can learn about this question. James chapter 1, 19 and 20. Look what it says. It says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. James was saying God has something to say about how we handle anger. He says, you got to be slow to get there. That means that we can't ignore it. We've got to be careful with what happens, what wells up in our heart. Then skip to verse 22. He says, but don't just listen to God's word. You must do what it says. Otherwise, you're only fooling yourselves. So he's drawing this comparison, like it's good to know how to control your anger, but don't just know it, you have to do it. And then look at verse 26. If you claim to be religious, but you don't control your tongue, and this is all tied to anger and frustration and how we treat each other, you're fooling yourself and your religion is worthless. Here's what I take away from these verses. When we ignore anger, it just grows and produces something that doesn't please God, no matter how religious or Christian we believe we are. Here's another way to look at it. This might help you understand it a little better. Two things, right? Why we can't ignore anger. The first one is righteous anger ignored leads to sins of omission. Let me explain what that means, right? If you see someone without food or without clothing, Jesus talked about it, right? That you need to help the needy, and you need to do something. When you're moved by anger, or righteous anger, you see something that's wrong, and God speaks to you, right, and makes you aware of it, and you ignore him, and the righteous anger that he's put inside of you, you're committing a sin of omission. That means God's telling you something that you should do, and you're omitting it. You're not doing it, right? You know the right thing and you choose not to do it. You ignore the anger and you go about your business. Remember, he talked about the Good Samaritan, right? These guys walked right past. They saw something. They knew they should do something. It should have infuriated them that somebody was beaten nearly to death, and they crossed to the other side of the street and they omitted taking care of somebody. On the other hand, this is your next fill-in, human anger ignored leads to sins of commission. Either way, ignoring our anger leads to sin, right? Remember, James already said it. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So when we ignore human anger, we leave it unchecked, we leave it undealt with, right? That's when we begin to commit other sins. And that list of sins can go on and on and on. We all know it. When we've been angry, when we left it unattended, we haven't dealt with it in our heart, it turns into things we say that are wrong, things that we do that are wrong, right? So what is anger? It's an emotion. Is it a sin to be angry? No. Can anger be ignored? No way. Guys, either way, righteous anger or human anger, we have to deal with our anger. We can't just leave it alone. And that leads me to the second big question that we need to address kind of in our own lives. This is a little more personal now. We talk about what anger is and what it isn't and the questions we have to ask, but now this one is for you and me to answer in a personal way in our lives, and it's this: who or what exactly are you angry with?